Hello, welcome. I'm Paul Guajardo, and I teach literature at the University of Houston. I'd like to share a few quotes by way of introduction. According to John Pfaff, mass incarceration is one of the biggest social problems the United States faces today. Our sprawling prison system imposes staggering economic, social, political, and racial costs. According to Michael Morton, who was sentenced to life in prison, prisoners wander for years through their lives unmedicated, uneducated, unwanted, and unloved. They systematically fail at everything: school, relationships, work. In the process, they alienate family and friends, and finally the law. Morton goes on to say that prison is a hate factory where inmates go in bad and come out worse, where men go in ashamed and come out angry. He says that plotting revenge is a common way for inmates to try to stay warm, locked in a cold cell, living in a cold world. Man's Inhumanity to Man, Mexican American Prison Memoirs, and the Miscarriage of Compassion. Prison writings have left a long and illustrious legacy, from the Apostle Paul to John Bunyan, Don Quixote, Oscar Wilde, Ezra Pound, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Antonio Gramsci, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Eldridge Cleaver, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Nelson Mandela, and more recently, Piper Kerman, her book Orange is the New Black. President Barack Obama was the first president to visit a federal prison, and President Donald Trump also met with prisoners. In any civilized society, there is the matter of what to do with those who break laws. We are well aware of the concept of, quote, paying one's debt to society, close quote. In other words, punishment. But ideas of mercy, remorse, transformation, rehabilitation, reform, redemption, and training are more difficult to execute. I know, bad pun. What do our prisons say about our society today? Too often these men are locked up and forgotten. Too often their punishment is cruel and unusual and dehumanizing. Did you know, for example, that more men are raped than women? But no one addresses this. In the New Yorker, Adam Gopnik writes that the problem with prisons is prosecutors. They are political creatures who get political rewards for locking people up and almost unlimited power to do it. Some 95% of criminal cases in the US are decided by plea bargains. In short, our system has huge incentives for brutality and no incentives at all for mercy. This is a sort of visual bibliography. Some of the books I've been studying recently in relation to this talk. Here are some questions that I would like us to think about. What's the problem with prisons? What do we learn from memoirs? Why should we care about prisons or prison memoirs? And why Latino prison memoirs? Well, in regard to those questions, here are some of the problems. Poor people receive inadequate legal defense. Justice is not always blind or fair, and minorities suffer more. Prisons have been called graduate school for criminals. There are many prison atrocities: murder, rape, violence, coercion, gangs. Disease. Too often prisons do not rehabilitate inmates. There is high recidivism, or a high return to prison. Some prison guards are corrupt. Prisons are expensive, and they're funded by taxpayers at approximately $35,000 per prisoner. Again, the question is, Why am I focusing on Mexican American or Latino prison memoirs? There are many works that address Blacks in prison, but far fewer that focus on Latinos. Hispanics are the largest minority in the U.S., and while rates of incarcerated Blacks are declining, the numbers of Hispanics in prison are increasing. Memoirs give us an insider's privileged view of what really happens in our criminal justice system. But why should we care about what happens in prison? Well, as citizens, we are complicit in the penal system. And as Fyodor Dostoevsky said, the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. He also said, a society should be judged not by how it treats its outstanding citizens, but by how it treats its criminals. Thus, as citizens, we are responsible, you and I, for the conditions in our prisons. How is it that so many primarily young men end up in prison? Based on Latino memoirs, here are some contributing factors to the prison problem. Fatherless children and single moms. Poverty. Few job opportunities for minority youth. Unsupervised children sometimes end up as juvenile delinquents. Drugs and gangs are a big problem. Less emphasis is placed on education in some of these families. And there is obviously a glorification of violence in our movies, music, social media, and video games. In this genre, there is a sensational and somewhat popular book, My Bloody Life, The Making of a Latin King by Raimundo Sanchez. The book is primarily about his association with gangs starting at the age of 11, but toward the end of the book, he ends up going to prison. This book is significant because it shows many of the steps that occur toward ending up in prison. And one of those steps is, of course, the life of a gang member. Reading some quotes from the book. Oh, how I hated her, how I wanted her to die. This was my first thought of committing a violent act, and it was against my mother. I was only 13 at the time. I thought sex with an older woman was the stuff of dreams. I smoked pot just about every hour of the day and night. Jenny smiled, then kissed me. It seemed as if she was proud that I was involved in crime. She didn't care about killing people. To survive street life, I had to be ruthless. Pulling the trigger was becoming second nature to me. I was now officially a bum, junkie, drug user, dealer, criminal, thief, stupid, violent, good-for-nothing, two-timing snake. I was 15. I was given guns so that I could kill and maim, and drugs so that I could learn the profitable business of dealing. Dino took a deal, pleaded guilty, and got 20 years for a crime he didn't commit. The real leaders of the street gangs were in jail doing hard time. All the big deals for guns and drugs were done through a penitentiary connection. I met many guards who would come by the neighborhood and pick up drugs to take back to prison. Guns made me feel like a man, brave. I carried a gun 24 hours a day. I shot at cars, buses, and trains. I harassed adults, teenagers, and rival gang members. People like myself, no family, violent, high all the time, on our own, were role models. Kids looked up to us and envied our lifestyle. I was blaming everybody for the predicament I was in, prison. I blamed the kings, Cano. I especially blamed my mother. This book by Casey Diaz, The Shot Caller, is typical of a subgenre within prison memoirs about how bad they were, and then how they found religion and reformed their lives. Here are some quotes from Casey Diaz's book. The warden was acutely aware that I wasn't someone to trifle with, inside or outside prison walls. I had stabbed people. I had stolen property. I had ordered others to take out rival gang members who double-crossed us. I had street cred in spades. A murder inside prison walls or outside in the exercise yard was swift and brutal. The most popular way of killing someone was jabbing a shank into their neck and slicing the jugular vein. My father harbored a complete hatred for me. I knew at that moment, at 8 years old, that I was capable of taking someone's life. Not only was I capable, but it would have been easy for me to do. Without male tethers in our lives, we naturally fell in and started stealing stuff, shoplifting. I didn't think it was wrong to steal. I easily justified my behavior. He sensed that the hole in my heart from not having the security of a father who loved me. I was 11 years old. With all my strength, I plunged the screwdriver into his soft underbelly. I was seeking male approval. I wanted to hear that I was good enough, that I belonged. I believe the main reason why gangs were so attractive is because things were so bad at home. I was given a public defender who went through the motions. A white guy on the floor lying face down. They took turns raping him. Each encounter elicited another round of blood-curdling screams. In prison, I had access to coffee, candy, tobacco, cocaine, and heroin. How was that possible in a state prison? Because of the cooperation of attorneys and prison guards. In the inner city, it is not cool to study, not cool to get good grades, and not cool to buy into education. Solitary confinement was one of the most brutal punishments that man can inflict on man. In the book, The Shot Collar, at the end, Casey Diaz gives some tips for keeping kids out of gangs and out of prison. He says that gangs recruit the very young, so be on the lookout. He says pay attention to your kids' clothes, pockets, social media. Explain the consequence of being in a gang. Ask yourself, what type of role model are you? Think about your work-life balance. Diaz says that single moms have the toughest assignment possible. He encourages us to paint over any graffiti in our neighborhood. He says take an interest in your child's sports or hobbies. Encourage academic success. Be approachable as a parent. If your child is in a gang, there is still hope. One of the problems with doing research about prisons and the need for prison reform is that there tend to be two camps. One camp is they deserve it. We should lock them up and throw away the key. We should increase penalty for crimes, etc. The other camp is the opposite. It's not their fault. We should let everybody out of prison. It's society's fault. And I believe that somewhere between those extremes, we can have an important discussion about how best to reform prison. Here are some myths about prison, and I am borrowing from John Pfaff's research. I believe he's a professor of law at Fordham University. He says most prisoners are in for possession of drugs. That's a myth. The majority of prisoners are nonviolent offenders. Again, another myth. The majority of people in prison are there for a violent offense. Murder, rape, assault, robbery with a weapon. Private prisons reap profits from the criminal justice system. One of the first things that President Biden did was to do away with private prisons through an executive order. The reality is that only 5 states even have private prisons, and percentage-wise, very few of our prisoners are in private prisons. One other tidbit is that in Florida, all private prisons, in other words, prisons for profit, have air conditioning for the inmates. But in Florida, all public prisons have no AC for prisoners. Another myth is that not sending someone to prison saves $35,000 per year. And this figure came up with how much is spent on prisons and how many people are in, and how much money is spent on prisons and how many prisoners do we have. If you divide those two numbers, you get 35,000 per person. But if you let one inmate out, your cost does not go down $35,000 because the major expense of prison is personnel, guards, and so forth, not food for prisoners or clothes for prisoners or medicine for prisoners. So a closer figure would be more like $4,000 to $6,000, maybe $8,000 is what we would save by keeping someone out of prison. Another myth is that long sentences are overcrowding our prisons. That, again, not true. Rehabilitation is a priority. There are many programs to help prisoners get an education, to help them get treatment for drug addictions. There's many programs to help them once they're out of prison. So rehabilitation is a priority of the prison system. Prosecutors seek justice, not just convictions. This is not true. Unfortunately, prosecutors get promoted or get raises or keep their jobs or get elected by putting people in prison. And often they are not interested in finding out who done it or in finding out what really happened. Somebody needs to be blamed for the crime and somebody needs to go to prison. Prosecutors also have almost unlimited resources. I'm exaggerating a little bit compared to public defenders. The accused do not always get a fair trial, because too often they will plead guilty to a lesser crime rather than risk doing more time if they are convicted in a jury trial. So as I read earlier, 95% of the people in prison are there because they plea bargained, not because they had a fair trial. The U.S. has more prisoners than any country. That we hear all the time, and that is also not true. There are at least 3 or 4 other countries that percentage-wise have incarcerated more people. Prisoners constitute low-paid labor for corporations. Some people like to refer to the industrial prison complex. And that sounds good, and yes, some prisoners do work for low wages, but the reality is that it's a very small percentage of prisoners who are working. Thank you so much. I hope that you will continue to think about ways in which our prison system can be reformed. These are our brothers, our fathers, our uncles, our friends, our neighbors who are imprisoned, and too often they are forgotten. And something needs to be done, and I'm hoping to increase the dialogue on this subject.